Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Lori Marino. Lori is a neuroscientist and expert in animal behavior and intelligence. She has her PhD in biopsychology, and she's known for her work on evolution of the brain and intelligence in dolphins and whales and other animals. She's well published and peer-reviewed in many scientific papers and book chapters. And she's considered an expert on marine mammal captivity issues. And she is the founder and executive director of the Kimmela Center for Animal Advocacy. And she is the author of a fantastic essay, which was the motivation for me to talk to her. I will put the link in the notes, but it's called Eating Someone. It's an Aeon. And we talk about that article and much of her research. In this conversation, we start off by talking about, well, what's intelligence and what is it in non-human animals? This is obviously a discussion that people continue to have. Obviously, it's huge in psychological research for humans. But intelligence is interesting when you start applying it to other animals. And so we talk about that. We talk about whales and their distinctive brains. We talk about whales and how they communicate. We talk about consciousness in animals more generally. We talk about the ethical cohabitation with animals. And we land for a bit on how domesticated animals, including farmed animals, have sentience, personality, and possibly consciousness, which dovetails into the ethics of eating animals. And we also talk about artificial meat and the future of that. And, as I say in the conversation, this is something that I've been more and more, I wouldn't say concerned, but I've been more pensive and introspective about, if, what are the ethics about eating meat? And as you hear my opinions and thoughts and her opinions and thoughts in the conversation, but I think it's a complicated issue. I think it's something that we have to think about, and how do we, navigate our lives accordingly. If we understand that many of the animals we're eating have, personalities, not just like us, but have personalities, and they're sentient and they can think and they have some theory of mind and they can do executive functioning, all the things, that other apes and including ourselves humans do. So it's a fascinating conversation. Lori was so generous and so wonderful, and she's obviously brilliant and has done some amazing research. And so I was really, really honored to talk with her. And now I bring you Lori Marino. I am here with Lori Marino. Lori, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Yeah. So before we get into some of the content today, just tell folks who you are and what you do and all the particulars.
Well, I am a neuroscientist who has studied dolphin and whale brains for over 30 years now. I'm currently the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and I'm also the executive director of the Kimmela Center for Science-Based Animal Advocacy.
So you are very busy.
I'm busy. Yes.
that's some great work there, and that sounds like you are very, very, very busy. One of the things I want to ask you is just kind of how you got into this in terms of studying different types of animals, and was that always something you wanted to do, or you just kind of fell into it? How did you get involved in all the many things that you're doing?
It has to go back to when I was as small as I could remember, always being interested in really one question. And the question is, what is it like to be someone who's not human? And it could be a bumblebee, it could be a dog, it could be a chimpanzee, it doesn't matter. But ever since I was a young child, I've been interested in other species. And so that's the path that I took when I went to college to study. What's interesting is that I began my studies in neuroscience and biopsychology because I've always been interested in how the brain is related to behavior and thought processes. But during that time, discovered that one of the things that I didn't like doing so much was invasive work with other animals. And so my interests and the way I practice science evolved over time through college, then afterwards, and then as a young scientist at Emory University in Atlanta.
And so do you find that much of your work is with whales and dolphins, or is it also with all types of animals as well? I mean, I've read some of your stuff, and I know it kind of goes with many different types of animals, but do you kind of have like one area that you, or one group of animals that you focus on in particular, or is it just kind of all over the place now?
Well, it's definitely dolphins and whales. Mm-hmm. That's been my focus for 30 years or more. Mm-hmm. I've done work with primates, particularly chimpanzees, and farm animals. So I guess if you had to say there were three animal groups that I know the most about, it would be those three. But dolphins and whales, certainly my focus.
That's. I think that's. I've talked to a few people that have worked with whales and dolphins and different types of marine life, and so it's always wonderful to talk to different people, kind of around the similar types of topics, and so then getting all the different kinds of nuance and everything. I'll tell you. So the way that I kind of found you was I was reading an article in is it Aeon
yeah, magazine.
Aeon. The title was called Eating Someone. I'm not sure, when did this come out? This is 3-4 years ago now.
About 3 years ago. I think it was 2018 or 2019, something like that. Pre-COVID times.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've heard various arguments for being vegetarian or being vegan. That's not what the article was trying to do, just for listeners. That's not how I took it, at least. But it was a really, really powerful, long form kind of essay article that really highlighted this idea of so many of the animals that we know and we interact with, including farmed animals, have this uniqueness to them, and that they have personalities, they have temperaments, they have likely sentience, of course. And the question kind of becomes, should we? There's all the ethics. Should we be, housing and torturing and killing all of these animals and then eating them and consuming them? And it was just one of those pieces that kind of really stuck with me for many, many, many years. And so it's really, really nice to kind of get you on and talk about some of the ins and outs. So we'll get to that article, but I wanted to just kind of at the top just kind of tell you my introduction to some of your work. So I guess the first thing I want to ask is we'll talk about a little bit like basically your research, which is what is it like to be a non-human animal, right? What is that like? What do we know about that? And so this is a super loaded top question. I'm not expecting you to just, solve everything here. But, the first thing I think one has to start with is, how do we define intelligence? And how do we define intelligence in non-human animals as opposed to humans? So kind of what's your potted way of kind of explaining intelligence and especially with non-human animals?
Well, I think that intelligence has to do with how you process information, how aware you are, and how much information you can process in a given amount of time and how deeply you can process it, the ways that you make associations across different kinds of information. But with that said, as you noted, I mean, if we asked 1,000 people, what is intelligence? You would get 1,000 different definitions, because intelligence itself can't be characterized on a very black and white level. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for me, it has a lot to do with how you process, or how any animal processes information. I tend to think that it is separate from things like emotions. But in terms of looking at a given mind, a given psychology, none of these things are in a vacuum. They're all processes that work together. But that's how I still look at intelligence from an information processing point of view.
And so with intelligence, then, I agree with your definition in terms of information processing. How do we know, I guess, one of the things that people will debate sometimes is, how do we understand intelligence as opposed to different types of learning or different functions of cognition, or sometimes just being able to repeat a skill? There are many animals that can do this. Octopuses do this, primates do this. There's many animals, both in the water and outside the water, that are able to kind of repeat things or kind of learn things, but that's not necessarily intelligence per se, unless you maybe disagree on this. But how do you kind of see this idea of learning as not quite intelligence, although it might be included in it? And how can we say the different levels of intelligence that certain non-human animals have?
Yeah, well, I think learning and memory are part of intelligence. I think perhaps what you're asking is a deeper question, which is, what are the other aspects? What are the other dimensions of a mind?
Yes.
So when another animal or another human shows that they're able to do a task of any kind, how much do they really understand in terms of what they're doing? And that's a legitimate question. So you can look like that you can teach chickens to play the piano. That doesn't mean that they understand they're playing a musical instrument. That's a silly example, but I think it kind of gets at this issue of how much does an individual fully understand about a situation? And I think then you have to start talking about things like awareness, self-awareness, situational awareness, and bring in other dimensions of mind that are there in other animals. But they fill out the picture in terms of what it is like to be another animal doing this task.
And I guess with whales specifically, so my understanding is that many of the dolphins and porpoises and whales, they're all whales. It's just a categorization. So you have toothed whales and baleen whales. That's my understanding in the taxonomy.
Yes, you have two suborders. One is the toothed whales, dolphins, and porpoises. They're called odontocetes. And then you have the mysticetes, and those are the large baleen whales, right whales, blue whales, humpback whales. And there's actually 76 different species of whales and dolphins, and many of them we only know from a couple of specimens that have washed up. So there's still a lot we don't know about this order.
Yeah. And so with whales, and of course, people will talk about, orcas, they'll talk about dolphins. But when we're talking about whales and all the categorizations, what can we say about their specifics in terms of their neuroanatomy, neurophysiology? Dolphins have very large brains. And of course, it's not just about size. It's more about neuronal density, et cetera. But what can we say about the mind and the actual physical brains of different types of whales, and what makes them distinct, and some similarities and differences from humans? Just kind of chat about what are some of the unique features of whales.
So it's interesting because, when you talk about whales or cetaceans in general, there's sort of a take-home message. And the first is that, all cetaceans are alike in the fact that there is something about them that makes them cetaceans, as opposed to giraffes or aardvarks or primates. So there's a cetacean-like nature that they all share, whether they're a little porpoise or a river dolphin or a blue whale. Then you have to consider species differences, and those are what I like to call little tweaks on different versions of being a cetacean. And then, of course, you have to go down another level and look at individual differences. within species and within communities of whales. So when you look at, the brains of cetaceans, which I've studied for decades now, some things jump out at you. Some of the things that are really outstanding is, as you mentioned, the size. But it's not just the size, it's the size relative to body.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at, our brains, they're about 7 times larger than you would expect for our body size. So you have to ask yourself, what are we doing with that big brain, walking around with that big brain? And we have to ask that same question of dolphins and whales. What are they doing swimming around with brains sometimes 3, 4, 5, almost 5 times the size you'd expect for animals of their body size? And that's very, very interesting. They also share characteristics like they have very convoluted neocortices, parts of the brain that does a lot of analysis and abstract thinking. And they also share a lot of parts of the brain that are the same, like the limbic system, emotional processing, and so forth. So there are some distinct characteristics of cetacean brains that are very unique among mammals that have to do with how they process sensory perceptual information. Because if you look at what they do with information that comes in through their auditory information, the visual information, it goes to a different part of the brain than it does in our brains, and then it gets processed in a different way. So there are real interesting differences there. At the same time, if you look at, again, the parts of their brain that are involved in things like memory, emotions, responses to stress, basic things like that, it's very, very similar to us. And so what's really interesting is, and what I've come to view cetaceans and humans as different versions of being mammals. We are different and similar all at the same time. And we have to look at this on a multi-level, on multiple levels. They're not alien. They're not entirely different from us. We can relate to them, but they're not identical to us. And that's the complexity of the issue.
Yeah, no, you describe it very nicely. And I think one of the unique features here is the fact that they communicate, right?
Yes.
And maybe that's the best way to describe it. I know some people will kind of wince at saying language because it's not quite that, but it is a form of communicating. Again, I've had a few people on and we've talked about this. So, but what is your, I guess in your estimation and within your research, the uniqueness and the complexity of which different types of whales are communicating, right? We can understand there is something going on. It's not random, obviously. It seems to be pretty complex, seems to be certain unique calls across large spaces over time with different pods. So what can you say about, I guess, some of the these complexities of communication with different types of whales?
Well, I think that one of the things we have to do is really look at the data and not go beyond the data. But a lot of the interesting analyses being done using artificial intelligence and things like information theory. When you apply some really fancy ways of analyzing the sounds of dolphins and whales, you find some very interesting things. You find that there's a lot of structure there. Now, whether it is like our linguistic structure, we don't know. We know that there are a lot of sort of higher order features that are very similar to ours in terms of level of complexity. But what we don't really understand, and you mentioned calls, we know that they have things like signature whistles and specific contact calls, but we know very little about the actual meaning of their communication system to them.
Mm.
So everything we've figured out is sort of the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
You see a certain situation and you hear this call over and over again, and you assume that the call has something to do with what's going on in the situation, but that's only an assumption.
Mm.
And so I think that we have a very long way to go before we really, really, truly understand the communication systems of dolphins and whales. And that's with tipping my hat to my brilliant colleagues who work on this issue. I mean, in the field, studying vocal repertoires. This is a tough nut to crack.
Mm-hmm.
The thing we are not very close to, and unfortunately, this is really what people want to know, is how can we have a conversation with a dolphin or beluga whale or an orca that sounds something like, "Hi, how is your day going?
Mm-hmm.
How are your kids?"
Mm-hmm.
And really, when you really think about it, that's really where we want to get to.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really far from that.
Mm.
But we are learning a great deal. And I don't know. I mean, language is a loaded term.
Mm-hmm.
Human language. I have no assumptions that human language is any more or less complex than perhaps some of the communication systems of many dolphins and whales. There's so many dimensions to their communication system. I can't assume that they are in any way simpler than ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's the common thing I'm told over and over and over is, well, we're just scratching the surface here. We're getting there. We're just getting there. We got 2%, and hopefully every couple of years we're getting a little bit more. So it's really exciting stuff to see all the things that come out. It's really, really cool.
Yes.
I guess in terms of, so we'll talk about this next kind of topic, and then we can branch out to some of the other animals you studied as well, such as farmed animals. Is about consciousness. Now, this is kind of the holy grail, right? We can't even figure consciousness out for humans, but it's interesting how, again, there's different models and different theories about consciousness.
Sure.
But what makes us, let me ask you this way, what makes us hypothesize that there are other animals that could have potentially consciousness? I mean, I've mentioned octopuses as being the big ones for various reasons. Mm-hmm. What are usually with scientists? What is it usually that the piece of it that says, there's something that the animal knows what it's like to be themselves, and that they are sentient enough to know that, et cetera, et cetera. What can we say about that, about other animals, being conscious?
Well, it's interesting because you asked the question of what is it that makes us think that other animals might be conscious or something like that. And I would turn that on its ear and say, well, what is it that makes us think that consciousness is unique to humans? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is because of what I know about how brains work and how nervous systems work, and what brains do. And while it is certainly the case that brains can process information unconsciously, for instance, in ways that we're not aware, I think that a first principle is that one of the things that brains and nervous systems do is make an organism aware of the environment, of themselves in the environment. Now, to me, that means that consciousness is a dimensional characteristic. It's not something that humans have and everybody else doesn't. That to me doesn't make any sense at all, particularly from a neuroscience perspective. You'd have to work pretty hard to make the argument that we're the only conscious organisms on the planet. And then if that's the case, you have to ask yourself, well, where are you drawing that bright line? And nature doesn't draw bright lines. So who are we to draw them? Now, with all of that said, what are some of the ways that we try to find out what the experience of other animals is like? And the ways we do that are very limited. We can only figure out what other animals are experiencing by translating that question into something we can recognize. And that's why, for instance, the mirror study has been so popular. Not because it is the only way to probe self-recognition or self-awareness, but it's one of the few ways that we have to do it in a way that we can measure it and recognize it. And so it's a very, very tricky issue. But I assume consciousness, maybe not at the same level or depth or richness, but from what I know about brains and how they work, to me, that's a much safer assumption than the other way around.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I feel, in trying to measure this, it's really hard because, partly because we don't have the instruments. Franz de Waal wrote that book, Are We Smart Enough to Know Animals, right?
Exactly.
And he basically makes this point of we're always with a handicap because we're using human instruments to try and study non-humans.
Exactly.
There's enough that has, there's some overlap there. So you mentioned the kind of mirror test, which is popular, I think, or the there's variants of the marshmallow test, which has some aspect of it, but it's, we're always kind of at a disadvantage there. So, it's a strange way to think. How do you create an instrument that is more accurate to whichever animal that's being studied, and then the part of translation into what we understand? So again, there's more work, in that area to be done for humans and for animals. I want to ask about some of the ethical stuff. This is in the article that you wrote, which was really, really powerful, which was, so humans are notorious for keeping animals captive for a variety of reasons. Pleasurable or historically for pleasure in terms of seeing animals at a circus. And of course, we know there's some pretty inhumane treatment of animals in circuses. And I'm not sure how much they still exist in the world today. But obviously, you have things like whale watching. Obviously, we have things such as farming. And then we have pets. So I recently talked to Mark Beekoff and Jessica Pierce, and they've written some really good stuff, and they've talked about the whole kind of aspect of pets and things like that. So I guess my question here is how do we build or develop, or maybe I should say expand, because I know some people do this for sure, a more, I don't want to say humane, because that's kind of anthropomorphizing, but how do we develop this kind of respect for more animals where we're not using animals for human benefit exclusively or only? And that's what I see in a lot of these categories, whether it is for tourism, if you know, or if it's for, pleasure, or if it is for eating. How do we have an ethical or moral structure for humans cohabitating the planet with other animals?
Well, that's the $64 million question, right? And, to date, we are not doing a very good job of it on any level, right? And so our human psychology defaults to the exceptionalism that we mythologize about, that we are on the top of some kind of a ladder of advancements and that everyone below us can be used. And we generally, take the view that, it's okay to use other animals in certain ways, as long as we try our hardest, try our best to not be exceptionally cruel or unnecessarily cruel. And you see that term a lot in animal welfare. But in fact, what it is a system that is essentially rigged to ensure that we are able to continue to do whatever we want with other animals. And so I don't, I think that is really something that is baked in to human psychology. And I've come to think that, what we need to do to protect other animals, is to enact ways to prevent our own species from using them in the way we want to. To give you an example, there's, obviously, we talk about farmed animals, and there's absolutely no real reason, life or death reason, that anyone should eat a pig. And yet, we do. Or some people do. And we make up all kinds of justifications for why we should be able to, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think that is going to change. There are always going to be people who will justify their behavior. So what do we do? Well, what we'd have to do is enact laws, legislation, policies that essentially prevent our members of our species from doing to pigs what we do. And that's why I'm really a proponent of rights-based policies, because I don't think welfare moves the needle very far. It stays within the current system of exploitation and allows us to continue to do what we want to do. Once we go past that into a rights-based domain, then you start talking about the fact that we have to actually limit our own behavior out of respect for the inherent rights of another kind of animal. That's hard. That's difficult. But I think that's where we have to go, because I don't think that we alone as a species are going to be capable of really stopping ourselves from doing all the kinds of things that we do. And it's not necessarily a critique. I mean, look at, for instance, animals used in medical research. There are none of us who haven't availed ourselves of biomedical research. And that's been done killing, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of mice, rats, monkeys, all kinds of animals. And nobody is going to say, oh, we need to stop that. And my grandma is sick, but that's okay. Let her die because 100 rats are going to die or something. That's not going to happen. That's not how human psychology is organized. And so we have to find a way to take that kind of exploitation off the table for us, because no one is going to put a rat before their Aunt Tilly or their grandma. And that's just fine. But knowing that, we have to know ourselves and then try to put in place things that limit what, as a species, we are capable of doing to other species.
So when I think of some of the counters I sometimes hear, which is, I mean, these are animals that, they've lived, longer than humans, they get on in the wild, they don't need humans, standing up for them. I mean, if you go and look in the wild, you see animals, they survive all the time, they kill and they eat each other, circle of life. We're just doing that, in mass production, but how is that any different would be one thing that people would say. The second thing is that people, I mean, you're talking about rights for animals and restricting us and rules and regulations. People are absolutely allergic to those words. They just can't hear any of that. You're going to tell me I can't do something? Absolutely. Now I'm going to want to do it more.
We've lived 2 years of it.
Yes,
right?
that's correct. Yes, that's correct. We've 2 years of defiance. So I mean, how do you have like a kind of cultural change in that way, or a global kind of change in how because that's the other thing. I mean, you can have it in one country, you know, how do you have it in, these other countries that have, more people than the United States, or that have, they have certain practices or things like that. That's one country might not do it, but there's still 200 plus countries that are going to keep doing it, and maybe so how do we work against some of the counters and then do it at a global scale? I mean, it's very difficult.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to scale up. We can't even get rights-based legislation for animals in one country yet. There's really no country that really enacts true legal rights for other animals. And, the Non-Human Rights Project in this country is working towards that goal for some animals in this country and also in other countries. But it is a tough, it's a huge lift. And the reason it's a huge lift is because it challenges our views of exceptionalism, of human exceptionalism. Our species is not capable of really understanding who they are. We're primates, we're great apes. And that scares us. That scares us because that means we're just animals, and then we have to give up this idea that somehow we're different enough that our lives, when we, all our kinds of religious practices and cultural practices that protect us from the reality that we're just great apes trying to live in the world. And so all of these practices, all of these efforts to protect other animals on a rights basis challenge that. They threaten that. And so it's going to be very difficult. And so we tend to stick within our comfort zone of just animal welfare. And that's important. And I don't have the answer. I think that at this point, one of the things that we need to do is really think about what is it that we can do to minimize suffering on this planet for humans and other animals, and give up perhaps the idea that somehow there's going to be a speciation event and we're all going to respect other animals and give up eating them and experimenting them on them and keeping them in cages and tanks out of the goodness of our heart. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, let me just try and really put a fine point on this, because I'm not a huge animal rights activist. I mean, I obviously care very much about animals, but I don't do that in my spare time necessarily, right? Many good people do that work. But so I don't want it to come across as, I'm just, kind of sitting over here, for animal rights. Not that that would be a bad thing, but I want to just kind of put a fine point on what makes this really convincing, at least in my mind, from someone that doesn't really do that. So in the article that I've referenced, which I'll put in the notes, is that some animals have a degree of facial recognition, which we've kind of mentioned as well. There's something to do with social cognition and perception. Sure. One of the things that you show in the article is that certain animals have been studied with versions of the big five, which, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, introversion, openness to experience.
Yes.
All these things about personality, which is pretty fantastic. And we can understand that these animals have, it appears to be individualized personalities, which gives them some type of individual kind of aspect. Many things such as maternal bonding, there's other things that you put in the article that are, when you're looking at these things, okay, well, there's a cognitive element, there's a personality element, there's maternal bonding. How they're able to not only with the idea of recognizing faces is that they're able to be aware. There's almost a quasi theory of mind that they're able to be aware of other animals, potentially of themselves, of their kin. Obviously, this is even for social animals, but even again, in the article, it's with pigs, cows, chickens, horses. It's one of these things where these are animals that we are on a daily basis putting in big farms and in the worst conditions, slaughtering them, and then treating them with disdain while they're still living, while they're dying, and then afterwards when we consume them. And so this is something that's really powerful, right? Because it's how can we justify if a farmed animal, we can talk about primates and whales and dolphins, but if a farmed animal is a someone and not a something, right? How can we ethically justify capturing, torturing, slaughtering, and then eating them? I mean, the biggest thing is that there's an ignorance piece of it, right? Okay, we don't know, or there's things we're not finding out. But if we're starting to find and know many of these things in terms of sentience, consciousness, theory of mind, social cognition, all of the personality, these are things that are true for us as humans.
Exactly.
How can we continue to be okay with those things? How do we have these things sit in our head at the same time? How do we do this?
Exactly. I mean, and we can't without a lot of mental gymnastics.
Yes.
So what I was trying to do in that article was deconstruct the assumptions we make about other animals that allow us to put them on our plate and eat them, and do it in a way that we can be comfortable about it. Because, the assumption or the justification that we use, as we're very smart animals ourselves, so we can think of all kinds of justifications for our behavior. And so one of the big ones about farmed animals is, well, why should I care? They don't care. They don't have lives like us. They don't care if they live or die. They don't care about their children. They don't care about their families. They're not individuals. They don't suffer. I mean, you can go on. And the question is, how accurate is that? And so, what I've done, and many of my colleagues, is really look at the science and say, okay, how accurate is that assumption that these animals really are just, automatons and are walking around and couldn't care less what happens to them or if they die. And so you look at the peer-reviewed scientific literature on chickens and pigs and cows, et cetera. And what does the science tell us? And when you look at the science tells us very clearly that a lot of these animals have characteristic psychologies, minds that are very similar to our own, and that tell us that they do have emotions. They do care about what happens to each other. They are individuals. They have personalities. And so you have to start there. Now, it's not the case that because you show someone that sheep can recognize individual faces, that they're going to stop eating lamb. But that has to be the starting point. And then you go from there. And then you have to add more ingredients, more factors to the mix in order to really reach people. For some people, that's enough, but for most people, it's not. But I think it's really important for people to understand that this is not anthropomorphism. This isn't just, somebody who loves their pig or their goat and, thinks that they're smarter than a 10-year-old child or any of that stuff. This is coming from the science. And the science tells us that if you want to make the assumption that these animals don't have the psychological wherewithal to care about their own lives, you're wrong. And you're going to have to go elsewhere in order to feel good about eating them. And that was the whole point of my essay.
Yeah, no, it's very effective. I mean, I'll just say, I was raised, eating meat, and I sincerely like the taste of meat. I mean, part of it is just my part of my maybe upbringing and stuff. But I will say, reading your article and then reading some of the scientific literature subsequently, it becomes harder and harder every year to to continue to eat, at the very least, certain types of meat. I definitely have a very hypocritical stance, and I have there's always this kind of pull inside where it's like, "Ugh, I don't feel the best doing this," and I have tried to kind of mitigate that. I guess the question I have here is, one of the last questions I have here is, what about, there's been some advancements of trying to make alternatives here. So some types of artificial meat. So obviously Beyond Meat is one of them, but I mean, I know there's some issues there, but I know that there have, some scientists have said, look, we can give you all the stuff, all the things, taste, you won't even notice the difference, taste the same, but it's, synthetic. It's not from an animal, and I don't know. What do you think about a future where that happens? Is that, is there problems with that? Is that maybe a good option? What are your thoughts, I guess, on those alternatives?
I think it's great. I think it's great. I eat Beyond sausages all the time. And I too grew up eating meat. I come from a family where my grandpa and a couple of uncles were butchers, I mean, this is not about making people feel bad.
Sure.
Or even guilty. This is about acknowledging our nature, right? Meat tastes good to many people. And I understand that. And I get that. And so we should do everything we can to decrease a number of animals that are being eaten. And I mean, in an ideal world, we would not be eating any animals who are factory farmed, especially, let alone, I mean, nobody really, except for indigenous groups around the world, really needs to eat meat. I mean, we know that. And so there's all kinds of inconsistencies that we have. And you mentioned that, like thinking about it. We have to learn to live with the fact that we're not perfect people and we're not perfect ethical machines, and find a way, nevertheless, to, within the context of who we are as animals, protect other animals from us. And if that means, creating artificial meat, fish, etc., why not? I think it's great. I am a big supporter of that. I know that there are many people in the vegan and vegetarian communities that think that it's almost a betrayal because, you're still eating something that looks like meat and tastes like meat. Yeah, but the fact is it's not meat. And so who cares? And my feeling is we should do everything we can to get people to eat less real animals. And if that means creating artificial meat, so be it. I think it's great.
No, yeah. I hear you. You on that. I guess the last question I have for you is, you do a lot of, work with animal rights and advocacy and conservation stuff. And so what is it that you most want, people to hear about ways in which, how we can better treat animals in general, whether they're in the wild or whether they're our pets or whether they're the animals that we are eating still? What is it that we can really take home and know mostly about, how we understand, animals in general, or whether it's specifically with whales? What is it that is really important for us as humans to again, cohabitate a planet with other animals in a respectful way?
Well, I think that we have to give up this assumption that we are somehow qualitatively different from other animals. And that's a tough one. We have to acknowledge who we are. We are great apes. We are nothing less, nothing more, but we are great apes, regardless of what we want to think we are. And so if we can just try to understand that other animals are relatives of ours, they are different versions of being who we are. They're not alien. They're not, there's no animal on this planet who we should not be able to relate to. And I include invertebrates, insects, octopus, anyone. We should be able to relate to them because in essence, we are all the same. We're just different versions
Mhm.
of being alive on this planet. And I think that that may help us to understand that we don't have a privileged position and that we can relate to other animals in ways that not only that may, limit how we exploit them, but also in a way gives us some company. We're always looking for company. We're always looking for another being that is we can share the experience of being alive with. Well, they're all around us, and they're not as dumb, and they're not as unaware, and they're not as alien as we think. They're really just a different version of us, and we're a different version of them. So, if there's any way that we as a species can move in that direction, I think that would be a good thing. And in the meantime, we do whatever we can to protect the other animals. Restitution, rescue, sanctuary, all the kinds of things that we need to do to make up for essentially what we've done throughout our history.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, Lori, I want to be respectful of your time, and so I of course, I could talk to you for many hours. You're so wonderful. So, what are the places for people to find you and your work? Where's the right place to point people in the right direction?
Yeah, you can find me in a few places, but the Whale Sanctuary Project, www.whalesanctuary.org, is where you can find our work on sanctuary for dolphins and whales. And you can contact me through there. Also, the Kimmela Center. And we have a new website that is coming online in a couple of weeks. I'd love to hear from people and to get different perspectives, and welcome any and all comments.
Yes, that's great. Well, Lori, I can't thank you so much enough for your time and your passion and your energy. This was, just so nice to have this conversation with you, and I hope to do it again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. Thank you.